program. Oregonians are proud of our state, but is this pride justified? What do our neighboring states think of our electoral processes, our unique initiative system, the prospects for our upcoming election season? Is Oregon's electoral grass in fact greener when it's viewed from across state lines? Today, City Club is pleased to welcome Idaho's Marc Johnson, Democrat from a red state, and Washington's Tony Williams, a Republican from a blue state, to discuss this very topic. For more than 30 years, Marc Johnson has helped shape public policy and counseled clients on public policy in Idaho and the Northwest. He's addressed issues that include higher education and the timber, healthcare, and energy industries. He's a frequent author of newspaper and magazine pieces on political and public policy. Notably, Marc helped engineer Governor Cecil Andrus's return to Idaho elected politics and served as both press secretary and chief of staff to Idaho's only four-term governor. Marc currently serves as a partner in the Boise office of Gallatin Public Affairs. Tony Williams is a founding partner of Washington2 Advocates, W2A, a consulting firm that helps over 24 Northwest corporations, organizations, and local governments manage their public affairs, communications, and political initiatives. Their clients include Boeing, T-Mobile, and the University of Washington. Tony spent 12 years on Capitol Hill, where he worked for 4 members of Congress. For 6 years, he served as chief of staff to U.S. Senator Slade Gordon. And in 1998 and 99, he was named to Roll Call's fabulous 50 list of top Capitol Hill staffers. Our moderator today is Jim Moore. Jim has been an independent political analyst in the Portland area since 1990. Jim is currently the political analyst for KOIN Local 6 Television and KXL 101 FM Radio in Portland. In addition, he's a regular source for a number of newspapers, National Public Radio, OPB's Think Out Loud, and several national magazines. Jim teaches political science at Pacific University in Forest Grove, where he's the director of the Tom McCall Center for Policy Innovation. And without further ado, help me welcome today's speakers to the stage.
Well, it's good to be up here with a distinguished panel. And we talked a little bit about what questions to do, but they gave me some ideas. I had some ideas from other places, but they don't know really what's coming. But we're going to start out with an easy one. I want you to get a sense of what the context is that they come from. And so for both of you, tell me about what the presidential campaign is like in your state. What are the issues? Is it going to be at all close? Any of that kind of stuff, so we get a sense about where you come from. And Marc, why don't we start with you?
Well, thank you, Jim. A pleasure to be in Portland today. Some of you know my partner, Dan Levy, who opted to go to the Pendleton Roundup instead of be with you today, so I'm the poor substitute. The somewhat balder, slightly thinner, and decidedly more liberal version of Dan Levy. Jim, to your question, what's the presidential campaign like in Idaho? When the Republican primaries began in earnest, when the Republican campaign began in earnest 18 months or 2 years ago, all of the Republican candidates at that time put Idaho in their column. There was absolutely no doubt that whomever was going to be nominated on the Republican ticket would carry Idaho's a whopping 4 electoral votes. Mitt Romney's been to the state 7 times to raise money. He's never met with the press, never had a public event. He doesn't need to. The one perhaps momentous occurrence that occurred in Idaho that relates to the presidential campaign is that Romney hatched the idea while in Sun Valley at Clint Eastwood's place to have him appear at the Republican convention. So that's the way the campaign looks from Idaho.
So I take it you're suggesting we should have another chair up here to just talk to? Okay.
Well, I know Tony's not an empty suit, so we'll just leave it at that.
So, well, from our, so this is kind of funny. It's almost a mirror image with one significant difference. I mean, obviously Washington's going to go for Obama, and it's going to be, he'll win by a very large margin. But I live in a little town called Clyde Hill, which is actually it's its own little distinct community, but it's near Bellevue. So you've got Medina, Hunts Point, and Clyde Hill. We're the first three little communities as you come across the 520 bridge and get to what we call the east side. And what's unusual about that area is we've seen the President of the United States, I think, has been in our neighborhood 3 times in 2012, and Romney's been there. He's been there a couple of times, and then Paul Ryan was in our neighborhood like a week ago. I guess, no, Monday. And so on the one hand, the presidential race is not even a topic of conversation in our state, and yet these guys have come because they can raise so much money. I mean, Ryan raised $3 million on Monday when he was in town. But so what a difference 4 years makes, though. So when President Obama was running 4 years ago, right, he would come to Seattle and would come to Portland, and tens of thousands of people would show up and all that. And now when he comes to Seattle, or Romney comes to Seattle, all we do is complain about them shutting down the 520 bridge for 30 minutes, right? I mean, we need to get across that bridge. And yet it's the same dynamic as what you've heard about in Idaho. The president, nor Romney, nor Ryan, none of them have had a public event. The closest thing to a public event was the president got out of his car and said hi to some school kids at Medina Elementary about 6 months ago. So it's an odd dynamic, although last comment that does crack me up. So from my back patio, we're about a quarter mile from 520, so you could, when these guys are in town, you could hear them. And so when Obama was here the last time, it was a beautiful day, and there were protesters. Now, okay, this is Hunts Point, Washington. There's like 20 of you people out there protesting, right? And there's 10 people going, boo, and there's 10 people, yay! But none of them are, they call it, and our police force is out there, the Clyde Hill police force, and I'm like, what are you guys doing, serving lemonade? I mean, come on. And so, anyway, it's a very genteel environment.
And just so you know, Paul Ryan left this building to go to your neighborhood. So, exactly. Looking at the elections, Oregon and Idaho have their elections in the spring. Washington has your elections in August. They used to be in September. It seems like the Oregon ones are kind of too early, and we kind of lose the campaigns over the summer, Oregon and Idaho, and in Washington it seems like you have them and then you just keep running. Is there any evidence that the date of the primary makes any difference in turnout or gives a party an advantage? Why don't we start with Washington, because you're the close one.
Yeah, well, so our primary date used to be the third Tuesday in September, and then it got moved to the third Tuesday in August, and now it's the first Tuesday in August. The reason for those changes is, unlike here where you have to have your ballot in by 8 o'clock, we just have to have it at the post office by 8 o'clock. So the problem with as vote by mail became so much a bigger, we're like you, almost every place in the state is vote by mail. There's a few precincts you can actually show up and vote. But the problem was, if all you had to do is have it postmarked, by 8 o'clock on election day, it takes 2-3 weeks to sort these things out, and if there's a close primary, you could literally be running up against the date that you need to get the general election ballots out, and you haven't decided this. So we move it up to August. Well, I'm sorry. What has that done? Turnout. We had our primary, and I think it was just I can't remember the final number. It was 35 to 36% turnout in a primary where you've got big races for governor. We had a big race for Congress. We had several seats in the legislature. There were some, very important ballot measures and things like that. And, people aren't saying, it's August. We got other things to do. And I loved, actually, the September primary, even as a political hack, because it meant that you just hunkered down and you're like a bear in the winter all summer getting fattened up. And then on the day after Labor Day, it was 2 months of just all on. And it was great. And for my mind, it was great for the public, too, because you only had to put up with those damn negative ads for 2 months, right? So anyway, there you go. That's our thoughts.
Well, Jim, the context in Idaho would be that the only real action in the primaries is on the Republican side. We went, for the first time ever this year, the May primary was a, quote, a closed primary. Had to declare your party affiliation in order to vote in the primary. Prior to that, we'd always had an open primary. You could go in the privacy of the voting booth and determine which party you were going to vote for. And so a number of very conservative Republicans in Idaho became convinced that we Democrats were regularly crossing over to mess up the Republican primary. Now, there are so few Democrats in Idaho that it's inconceivable that that could have...
All 12 of them, right?
all 12 of us, and we all live in the same precinct in the north end of Boise, so...
A plot hatched at Mark's house, right, over wine. Let's go screw up the primary.
So we did. We closed the primary. Republican legislators closed the primary against the advice of our very conservative Republican governor, who did not support that, and the turnout was abysmal. One of the worst turnouts ever in a primary election in Idaho. But what it will do, I think, over time, and probably has already done, is to make the Republican Party even more conservative in Idaho, make the legislature more conservative. But if there were a Democratic primary, a Democratic Party in Idaho to speak of, there's potentially a great opening here to go for those folks who are, you know, moderate, mostly Republicans, but once in a while would consider a Democrat, as they did with my old boss on 4 different occasions in 3 different decades. So the only action in Idaho in the primary is in the Republican Party.
Let's begin to move towards Oregon, but we'll do it from a regional point of view. What are that you see in the region, and let's go to Montana and places like that. What are the key races for governor, senator, you know, key parts of the House, those kinds of things that you see out there?
Well, just a quick word about Idaho. There's really nothing going on. This is one of those weird circumstances that happens every dozen years where statewide races are out of cycle with the presidential campaign. So we've got legislative races, and we have the 2 congressional seats, which Republicans will obviously hold, and nothing else really on the ballot. So not very much going on in Idaho at all. So those of us who are political junkies have to look to Oregon and Washington and Montana for any sustenance whatsoever. Montana has a critical, I think Tony would agree with me, a critical U.S. Senate race. John Tester, first-term incumbent, facing a really stiff challenge from Denny Rehberg, a Republican. All the polling that I've seen and my intuition tells me it's a cliffhanger and we'll go right down to the wire. There is a Brian Schweitzer, the governor of Montana, quite popular governor, spoke at the Democratic Convention recently. He is term limited, so you have a spirited contest there for the governorship in Montana. But the Tester-Rehberg race has national implications with regard to Republicans potentially controlling the Senate.
And what do you see?
Well, so, you know, I mean, I mostly stick close to home. I mean, but when I look out in the Northwest, you know, there just isn't that much. I mean, here it's relatively quiet. I mean, the mayor's race, I would put that on as one that's got a lot of people interested and that folks around the region are watching. You know, Idaho, as Mark mentions, is quiet. This Senate race in Montana, that's a big bonanza for sure. But you know, Washington, it's an exciting election year this year. I mean, the governor's race is the marquee race. We have one of our new. We picked up a congressional district, so we now have 10, and one of them was drawn. The first congressional district, which was the district Jay Inslee was in, but once he was running for governor, then they could carve his district up, and it's a 50-50 district, and it's so people are really closely watching that one. And what's interesting is it runs from where I live in Clyde Hill to the Canadian border, all east of I-5. So the Democrat is from my neighborhood, and was a relatively moderate Democrat, but she had to get through a 4-person primary, and she moved quite significantly to the left to win that primary. So she's strong in the southern part of the district, and then the northern part of the district, which is the Republican part, she's not going to do very well. The Republican is a very conservative guy from the northern part of the district who will do really well down there, but he will not do very well where I live. So that race, that'll be really interesting to see. You know, the other big races, we got pot, gay marriage, charter schools, 2/3 majority to vote for, in the legislature, to vote for taxes. We're much like here, where our state senate is, the Democrats have a 3-seat advantage, so there's a big fight with the state senate, and so you know, I think if there's any state in the region that's got a lot going on for whatever reason, we're it. And then we here, or we in Washington State, like you, are obviously also watching the Vancouver Columbia River crossing section. I hope today we get a chance to talk about that a little bit too.
Just in case you're wondering, we do not have gay marriage or pot on the ballot.
They have freeways to Oregon and Washington.
We have a 10, we're going to let you have 20 guns per day rule going.
Well, let's get into some of those issues, and let's start with the Columbia River crossing. The Columbia River crossing, you know, clearly a big deal here in Portland, but it's because it's now at the top of the White House's agenda with no money. Because you know, it's supposed to be crucial to interstate commerce, and it's going to bring in, the Senate's got to play a role. I mean, the national government's playing a role, the governors are playing a role in there. So talk about that in terms of the governor's race and those kinds of things. How would you view that as we sit here on one side of the Columbia River crossing?
Yeah, so you know, it's an interesting issue to look at and watch, and it reminds me a lot of the decisions in the Seattle area about bringing light rail to Bellevue. And you had a very similar, in some ways, some similarities there, where Seattle very much wanted to see light rail move to Bellevue. A lot of people in Bellevue didn't so much like the idea, and some of the issues, there's a bridge issue involving the I-90 bridge and whether or not you can run light rail over that bridge. And then you've just got the bad juju between Seattle and Bellevue. I mean, you know, part of it's funny when I always tell people, oh, I moved to Seattle because it's just easier to get through it. But when I'm, you know, at home, I'm like, oh no, I live on the east side. I live in Clyde Hill. I never go over to that crazy place. You know, there's very much that kind of competition. And here, so we start with here. You can just sense the Vancouver-Portland situation coming out. You know, the difficult thing for me on the issue, watching it, if you're the candidates for governor, is it just seems like you could be as well schooled as you want on it, but if you're not in that issue every day, you're likely to say something stupid, right? Because, I mean, there's so many different layers to it. I can't even myself really understand what they're voting on over there in November, and yet I will tell you, all of you joyous, lovely people here in Portland, I've met with several people here, and you all start with, you know, dissing on Vancouver, which is exactly what happened in the Puget Sound over the Seattle-Bellevue thing. The Seattle people all started by dissing on the Bellevue-ites. The Bellevue-ites turned up their nose at Seattle, and then eventually, you know, you get to the issues. And I think right now that's a big part here. And I think the other thing to think about that issue is it is a great plum opportunity for this part of the state, but you're going to have a new governor. You've got a congresswoman over there who's going to be there for a long time. She's got a safe seat. She's delving into this issue. You guys are going to have a new mayor. We're going to have, who knows what the situation is in D.C. of who controls Congress. The president, if he's reelected, he's in a second term, and yes, he's put this at the top of his agenda, but he's likely to have a new Secretary of Transportation, and we all know in a second term, domestic issues go down, or we may have a different president. And I just think the issue is sort of setting up to go into a reset period, if you had to ask me.
Could I just make one facetious comment and two serious comments on, and Tony knows way more about the crossing issue than I do. Although I do have to establish my Oregon bona fides. My wife and I pay property taxes in Manzanita. We spend quite a bit of time on the coast and love it here, and have great affection for Oregon. But from our perspective as looking downstream from Idaho, we think of you as Portlandia, and you probably think of us as Ron Paul-landia. So that's the facetious point. The serious point is, and this probably comes right out of Democratic talking points, but I'm an infrastructure guy. I think investments in that overused word, infrastructure, highways, airports, rail systems, is a path back to some kind of economic stability and growth in this country. And I really, the merits of the issue notwithstanding, I think we ought to be looking seriously at a national policy and state level policies that allow us to get after some of this crumbling infrastructure. We really need to do that. Or we continue to fall farther and farther behind the rest of the world where we're trying to compete. From a trade standpoint, I would argue that folks upstream in Idaho have a stake in how well those issues are managed over on this in this part of the Northwest. And my second serious point would be, I long for the days when we had more regional cooperation on these kinds of issues. You know, with all due respect to Governor Gregoire and Governor Otter in my state, they don't talk to each other unless they're issuing competing news releases. And it wasn't always that way. C. Sandris and Tom McCall and Dan Evans got along extraordinarily well, did lots of things that were in the best interests of the region. Succeeding generations of governors did the same thing without regard to partisanship, but what was good for the Northwest. And we had members of Congress, and Slade Gorton was one of them, who behaved that way when they were in office. We need to find a way to get back to that balanced regional cooperation.
Hey, Jim, can I just one point? I have one. Boy, that well said, and I'm glad you all clapped. I'm ready to vote for Mark, by the way. So one just little interesting point.
I might get elected in Manzanita, maybe. I don't know.
He's going to run for city council. But building on Mark's point on the regional component of this, so I went to my 30th high school reunion this summer. I grew up out in Troutdale, and I was struck by how many kids I grew up with. A lot of them stayed in the local area, but a lot of them still consider themselves living in the local area. And where do they live? Live across the bridge. Where do they work? Right here. And you all know all that in your bones already, but it was a very interesting little focus group. We obviously did not talk about Columbia River crossing, but that bridge isn't just some interesting little piece of infrastructure. I mean, it is a critical component to the region, but again, I go back to sort of tying into Mark's point. Right now, my sense, two states are talking past each other, the two cities are talking past each other, and you're going to have to sort that out soon.
Could I make just one other point for Tony's benefit and to establish our shared connections? Tony brings to politics something that I think I bring to politics and my partner, Mr. Levy, brings to politics. Tony practices Republican politics in a blue state. I practice as a Democrat in a red state. Worked for a Democratic governor in an overwhelmingly Republican state. Tony helped Slade Gorton get elected and govern and be effective as a Republican in a blue state. So we bring an orientation to this game of politics that is a little different than folks who didn't work in that kind of environment for those kinds of political figures. And it puts a premium in my mind on how you find ways to carve off the hard edges of some of these difficult issues and to find ways to cooperate and get some things done that move the ball. And I think all of us would, without regard to our politics, would say we got to get back to that in Washington, D.C. We got to find some way to deal with the fiscal issues that confront the country, the budget issues, and there's no way to do that except to admit that nobody has all the best ideas, and pull yourselves up to the table and pull your socks up and get after it.
Let's bring that idea here to Oregon and your individual states. You've made it very clear Idaho is basically a Republican territory. In Oregon, we have not elected a statewide Republican in a long time. Our legislature is certainly competitive, but statewide level, not so much. And in Washington, there's competition going on there. So what are your suggestions from a state where the competition is happening, a state where the competition is not happening? What are your suggestions on ways to take that hard edge off or inject bipartisanship back in or something? Does it depend on a really good candidate that the personality cuts across lines? Does it depend on rethinking ideology? Think of the role of environmentalism just in the past 40 years and where that's changed and gone. I mean, what do you think it takes? Let's start with you.
Well, so yeah, I mean so we, I'd like to say we're super competitive at the statewide level in Washington. We are in certain races. Secretary of State's a Republican. Attorney General, we typically win that race, and Rob McKenna, who's running for governor, is the incumbent Attorney General. But we've had trouble winning what I call the big ones: governor, U.S. Senate. My wife, if she were here, she'd say, hey, if you want to run for office in Washington State and you want to come really close and have it drag on for 3 weeks and lose in a heartbreaker, you hire my husband to run your campaign. So, Gorton 2000, we lost by 2,229 votes out of 2.5 million cast. I helped Dino Rossi in 2004, and we won like 27 times and then lost. We won twice and we're ahead twice, and then he loses by 159 votes, 162, whatever it is. So it's very hard, and I think a big part of it is the national Republican brand at all times is a drag on anybody running statewide. And in this race, it's the biggest problem Rob McKenna faces in winning this fall is, when you have Republican by your name, and in our state, when you run ads at the state level, it has to say Rob McKenna, Republican. And so right there, I mean, you've just turned off a big chunk of the electorate. I saw a poll that the #1 reason why people are voting for Jay Inslee, he's a Democrat. I mean, that tells you the state and its makeup. But so first is just the national branding problem, and then the second is what we're talking about here. If you're a uber conservative Republican, the best you're going to do in Washington State at a statewide level in a competitive race, in a real race, is get 40%. I mean, there are, where I live, it's a nominally a majority Republican area, but I guarantee you there's a whole lot of people who may vote for their Republican candidate for legislature who are going to vote for Obama this fall. They're going to vote for McKenna, but they're going to vote for Maria Cantwell for the Senate. And it's this if you come across as too conservative, it's the same dynamic there as it is here.
Yeah, I would say it's almost the mirror image in Idaho in a way. The national Democratic brand is a huge anchor around anybody who's running on that ticket in my state. So to try to respond to Jim's question, what does it take? It takes politicians. If we're going to break this down, one of the things it takes are political figures who are willing to do things that are not in lockstep all the time with their political brand. And I think Tony worked for a guy like that who would go off in an independent direction once in a while. I certainly worked for a guy like that in Idaho. And it tends to not blur the party lines, but make them less important in a way, I think. So I am really attracted to political figures in both political parties who are willing to say no to their friends, because that's one of the toughest things to do in politics, is to say no to the people who put you where you are, or provide you campaign support or whatever. But oftentimes, in order to get something done and to be able to cooperate a little bit with the guy on the other side of the aisle, you've got to be able to say no to the people that brought you to the dance.
Let's shift to another part of politics, the initiative system. Oregon and Washington are pros. If you study Oregon, Washington, California, I think you've covered the initiative system right there. But it's coming the case in Oregon, as we see, especially in California, and I'm beginning to get the sense it's happening in Washington too. Voters pass initiatives, and then they're frustrated because they didn't understand what the initiative would do, or politicians oppose it and change it, and it begins to contribute to driving down the interest and faith that people have in the political system. So is there a cure for that? What do you see in Washington that we may pick up in Oregon? Our initiatives, we're going to have basically 9 ballot measures, 2 of them from the legislature. One of them is gill netting, which may or may not be serious anymore. But there's some big stuff out there. What do you see in Washington as you look at this kind of conundrum?
That's a great question. So there's another, I guess it would be to add on to your question. There are now people who specifically try and get a certain kind of ballot measure on the ballot simply to drive certain kinds of voters to the polls, and it's more about a different election than that. So it does, there's now what started out as, the citizen's best way to engage in the process, not best way, but a way to engage in the process beyond talking to their elected official. There is now, like anything in politics, a level of cynicism and professionalism around these things. By the same token, you look at the things that we're going to decide this fall in Washington State, and, there's a couple of them that I'm not terribly interested in, but I am interested in the one about charter schools. I think that's a good discussion to have. I'm actually think this thing, the discussion over marijuana and marriage equality and all of that, those are big issues that seem to be getting discussed. And the danger on something like the marijuana initiative is what you're talking about. Is there's a great book called The Dance of Legislation, written 30 years ago by a guy who worked for Warren Magnuson. And it takes this long to describe one piece of legislation because there's a lot that goes into what we call the sausage making of government. And to think you can resolve an issue in one paragraph is a very difficult thing. I'll give you one example from Washington State that is a burr under my saddle, which was 5-6 years ago. We passed an initiative on renewable energy, passed 5149. And the result is a lot of energy companies are going out and creating other sources of energy, which is not in itself a bad thing, but in Washington State, this initiative did not declare hydroelectricity to be a renewable, and and secondly, we've created policy now where a bunch of individuals are doing this kind of renewable energy simply because it's the tax code or whatever related to that, versus this is a need we need to have. And so at the end of the day, I don't know how you stop citizens from going out and getting these petitions. Two, it is hard to legislate in a paragraph. And I guess if you're to do any reform, the one possible reform, whether this is constitutional or not, I don't know, is you can prevent people to pay people to get signatures. That might be one way to stop it.
Which clearly in Oregon is not the case.
I'm sort of a small p populist about these ballot measures. On the one hand, I completely agree with Tony's assessment of how they can be misused, and they are misused. We have a very high threshold to get an issue on the ballot in Idaho, relatively speaking. But we have 3 referenda on the ballot in November to basically overturn some education reform efforts that the Republican governor, state school superintendent, and the legislature passed 2 years ago. So, the signatures were collected, paid signature gatherers, financed by the teachers union, basically, to get those issues on the ballot, and we'll have a good, I hope, a robust debate about that this fall. Not a bad thing, in my mind, because it came out of the legislature without a lot of debate. We've had 2 years to sort of incubate the whole subject, and now have an opportunity for the voters to say how they feel about it. So that's not a bad thing. However, there are some crazy things that get on the ballot, and having if you could, again, constitutionally and responsibly, have a little more of a governor, if you will, on how these things get framed and put on the ballot, so that they maybe were a bit more nuanced than they sometimes appear to be when you're standing in the voting booth and voting up or down on marijuana or something.
So to some, they're good if the issue is something we really need to talk about. But if it isn't, boy, it gums up the system. Would that be fair?
Yeah, I think I see where you're going. The other problem is once
this
something
is full employment for political consultants. Though.
Right. Yeah, we want more of the. Pat McCormick's over there going, no, I love initiatives. I'm sorry, we're only picking on Levy today. That's right. Dan, bad boy. No, the challenge with these initiatives, right, is I tend to be on Mark's side also. That I sort of they don't particularly bother me, and I like to see people excited and doing these things. The challenge is if something's passed and it is truly, one paragraph doesn't lend itself to law very well, the process to fix that is very difficult. I mean, if you're an elected official and you're like, okay, so the voters voted for this thing, and now I'm supposed to go undo this and then take the grief from somebody, you know, that's the dynamic you run into. And I think in our state, actually the legislature can't touch it, I don't think, for 2 years. I think that's right. So, you know, it's a complicated process.
Remember back when term limits were the issue du jour, we passed in Idaho a really tough term limits law. And almost immediately became obvious that you go to some of these really rural counties, you know, Camas County, Clark County with 1,000 people, where they have an elected sheriff, an elected coroner, elected assessor. You know, those people have been in office doing a credible job in many cases for decades. And all of a sudden you're going to term limit the popular local sheriff. It didn't make any sense. The legislature, of course, over time repealed the term limits because they were concerned about their own term limits. But as a practical matter, it was a boneheaded thing to do. Just talking strictly at the county level, it was a boneheaded thing to do.
Well, let's get to another issue that's gigantic in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, and probably every other state in the country right now: education. Education quality and funding in Oregon, especially K through 12, has been a bone of contention for decades. I'm a little bit older than you, but I decided when I was going to college to aim out of the state and kind of get away from it just because of the strangeness that was going on. It's a long time issue. So K-12 education, what do you see in your states? And more importantly, what are there regional solutions to this? I mean, we're getting stuff from the national government. Obama's got these competitions going on. Bush had No Child Left Behind. They're still not really coming up with any funding for any of this, but we're getting national pressures. Should there be a regional set of solutions rather than state by state? So let's start with you.
Well, I'm a squishy liberal, so I always look for the regional solution where people can come together and figure out things on a regional basis. I do think we have a regional economy. As I said earlier, Idaho exports travel down the river or the highways to the ports of Portland and Seattle and other places. We have a regional economy. We have a regional need for a workforce that is capable and trained for the 21st century. So maybe there are some reasons to think that we should be doing more on a regional basis. Some of the higher education institutions in the region are doing some very collaborative and potentially very important things, sort of without regard to the boundary lines between states. So obviously I encourage that. I think that's a good thing. In my state, we're having a robust debate over, we did away with collective bargaining for public school teachers. We are emphasizing, whether it's a good policy or not, I'll leave others to decide. We're emphasizing online learning, perhaps at the expense of classroom learning for students. Part of that initiative was to provide every student above a certain grade level with a laptop computer, which sounds like a great idea, but think through the practical implications of that. So we're having a really robust debate about the shape of public education going forward. Now, at the same time that we're having this debate at the K-12 level, we're systematically defunding higher education. Higher education went from, I think it was 18 or 19% of the budget, the entire state budget 4 or 5 years ago, down to 12% today. So what's happening? Tuition's going up. The cost for families to put kids through college, even at a state institution where it's still relatively affordable, continues to rise. We have an abysmal matriculation rate of high school graduates going on to post-secondary education in our state, and that does not bode well for the workforce of the future. So I think in an interesting way, I hope in an interesting way, there is starting to develop a national consensus that this is the problem of the early 21st century, that we have to figure out a way to fix our school systems. We have to find a way to invest in higher education for that workforce of the future. It's going to take a lot of sacrifice from a lot of different people, Right now, the teachers union, as you can see in Chicago, is on the wrong side of history at this moment in time. They're doing themselves uncalculable damage, I think, by the way they've handled that situation. And Tony and I were talking over lunch. Rob McKenna in Washington, a Republican, conservative Republican, talking about the need to invest in higher education, among other things, from an education standpoint. Rahm Emanuel, very democratic, liberal mayor of Chicago, taking on the teachers union. This is in the old man bites dog category. It's not news when the dog bites the guy, it's news when the man bites the dog. And so something is happening here in terms of changing the dynamic about how we think about education, and it's long overdue. I worked for a guy who consistently ran saying we needed to invest more in education and succeeded in doing that year after year after year. And money is a critical component here, but there are other elements that have to be factored in to how we improve the performance in the classroom, get more kids to higher education, and improve that workforce. That's, there's no substitute for that.
Well, so I'm going to start with, I feel like right now in my life I'm getting almost a 360 look at our education system. I've got a second grader in our neighborhood public school. My 8th grade son is a special needs boy, so I get to look at what the school experience is for him. I'm on the board of the Oregon State University Foundation, and I'm on the board of a small independent school, private school in my neighborhood. And my wife just spent 5 years at the Gates Foundation, where her colleague was Vicki Phillips, and she's now a consultant working on these things. And my point in telling you that is, one, I can tell you growing up in Troutdale and going to Oregon State, I never thought I would be into education the way I am, but
I'm going to OSU,
yeah,
too.
and just the fact that I got out of there is still remarkable. But I agree with. Here we are in the middle of a very difficult, obvious economic period, and yet both in Washington, both in Oregon, and nationally, education is a very much top tier issue, top of mind. And so one, I agree with Mark that I think it is on the way to being the 21st century issue, at least for some period of time. Part of that is ongoing funding. Funding is what it always is, though. I mean, I think that's a big part of it and needs to be addressed. I'm not dismissing it, but I'm sure people have talked about school funding for a long time. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. My sense is yes. But I do know that the big debate right now is also, though, about performance in the classroom and standards, and also what kind of kids are we raising. I can tell you, as a father of a second grade, you want to know what worries me more? Because he lives in my house, I'm not all that worried about math and science and him graduating from high school and going to college. I'm wondering if I'm going to have a kid someday who's ready to compete in the world as a human being. I mean, every day he gets up, he's got 27 things to do. He wants more technology gizmos, and yet he doesn't have very much time to go play in the bugs in the backyard and learn how to problem solve. And so we've got an education system, I think, that right now what you're seeing all the stress is we're trying to figure out what we want a modern education system to look like. So that's one problem. Two, I can tell you from the Oregon State side of the things, one of the biggest things we spend money and time on every year is getting freshmen ready to be college students, because we're not doing it in our high schools. Now, Oregon State, we're fortunate. I want to brag on Oregon State. We get more valedictorians and salutatorians from the state of Oregon go to Oregon State than any other college, I'm told. So that's a good thing. People obviously care about education because Oregon State, we're in the middle of our first ever campaign. Never had a campaign before. We started one 5 years ago. We're at $875 million raised, and we're going to hit $1 billion at little old Oregon State down the road there. So I think, I don't have any big answers other than I'm a dad trying to figure out how to make it work. But what I can tell, what I sense is a lot of stress as we try to figure out what the education system should look like. And then my last comment will be, nothing irritates me more when people talk about education and they forget one critical 4-letter word: kids, right? It's always about the adults. Chicago right now seems to be about the adults, and I'm hoping we start to talk about the kids. So I'm going to get off my high horse now.
Thank you very much. This is a fascinating conversation, and it's time for us now to turn to questions that come from members of the City Club. If you have a written question on an index card, please hold it up high so the City Club staff can collect it from you. Thank you. The first question for our group today, as always, will come from our Friday Forum host. Today, Deane Funk. Deane is manager of local government affairs for Portland General Electric and serves on the boards of Travel Portland and East Metro Economic Alliance. He's been a City Club member since 1992.
So the title of today's program is Oregon's Electoral Grass Greener? Green is a loaded word these days, and if you combine it with grass, well, I think you have next week's City Club Forum. And I presume green has nothing to do with the new economy either. So I was listening to talk about the differences in the states, and one of the things that interests me, being sort of myopic here in Oregon, is the groups with influence. In Oregon, I have the sense that we have particularly strong public employee unions and maybe a weaker business union. That sort of came out in the Measure 66, 67 tax measures a few years ago. I'm wondering if you can explain which groups in Oregon or in Washington and Idaho have particular influence that maybe we don't have here, farmers maybe in eastern Washington or something like that, and maybe what we could learn and where we need to strengthen to get a little bit more balance in our politics in Oregon.
Well, first, as a Beaver, I don't recognize the color green. Sorry for all you ducks out there. Well, you know what's so growing up here in Portland and now living. So I grew up in Troutdale. You know, went to Oregon State, went to D.C. for 17 years, and then moved to the Seattle area 6 years ago. The thing that I'm struck by, the biggest difference that I feel between Seattle and here is it's just a much bigger corporate community. I mean, you start with, look at my client list: Boeing. You've got T-Mobile. We've got Amazon, Microsoft, we just on, and it's so there's obviously, despite the fact that a lot of people on my side of the fence say it's a horrible place to do business, there's a lot of really cool companies that are headquartered in Seattle. So you've got a much bigger business community, and the influence of Boeing cannot be understated. I mean, we want to keep those airplanes being built there. Same with Microsoft. I mean, it is not just an interesting little garden party of Microsoft versus Google or whoever their competitors are. I mean, it's a personal thing, and of course there are Google people working in the Seattle area, but those the big corporate base, and then Eastern Washington. We have 2 congressional districts over there. We have a big city in Spokane. We've got other large cities in Yakima and Pasco and places like that. So there are just more people over there. And I think that provides a little more influence on the dry side of the state than it maybe does here.
We have a very hybrid business community, but it's very politically influential. We have a certain corporate presence in the Boise Valley for the most part, Micron Technology, for example. And we have a still pretty robust natural resource industry based on agriculture, timber, and interestingly, over the last 5 or 6 years, more mining than ever than in the recent past in Idaho. Phosphate mining in southeastern Idaho, precious metals mining, historically in the Coeur d'Alene region, but lots of gold exploration taking place in Idaho now. So we have this sort of high-tech oriented economy in the southeastern or southwestern part of Idaho, and at the same time a very natural resource-based economy. They have a lot of influence in the legislature, and I would argue they should have a lot of influence in the legislature. We don't have public sector unions to speak of. We have a robust environmental community in the state. They don't have much SWAC at the state legislative level, although they can, on a selected issue where they can make common cause with agriculture or a community, they can have real impact on things like facility siting and that sort of thing. So it's a robust business community that has a lot of influence.
We will now take questions from the floor. As always, we invite members to the microphone to ask their question. Asking questions at a Friday Forum is a privilege of City Club membership. Before asking your question, we ask you to ask your question in 30 seconds or less. Please identify yourself as a City Club member. If I flash this question mark card, it means please wrap up your question. Also, I'll try to read a question from the audience on the index cards.
Win Wakala, City Club member and also former Beaver Belle. Yes. The City Club recently had a series of forums on education, and I'm Finnish. You can tell by my last name. And Finland is one of the top countries in the world for their education system. I personally also work against things like human trafficking. And the thing I'm concerned about, and what I like about what Finland does, and I wondered how you think this would work for us here in the United States, is they start first with the welfare of the child before they try to teach them. They make sure they're fed in the morning. We used to have nurses in our schools. If we could look at the whole welfare of the child, and then they also, another thing they do is they teach on an individual basis instead of lecture style. So you're doing one-on-one more. So how would that work here?
I'll give you a quick, short answer. I'm a big believer in early childhood education. My old boss used to say, and I believe it absolutely is true, that every problem in society comes to the schoolhouse every day. Poverty, nutrition, child abuse and neglect, health problems, they all show up at the schoolhouse every day. So having a student as early as is practically possible start to get prepared for that learning experience it's a no-brainer in my estimation. In my state, for cultural and somewhat religious reasons, we have been very reluctant to robustly embrace early childhood education. And it's one of the reasons why we have a high I believe it's one of the reasons we have a high dropout rate and we don't send enough kids on to higher education.
That's interesting. I just learned something there. So one of the things that's, I think, really great in Washington State is we have a pretty vigorous early learning program, and we have a Department of Early Learning. I don't know if it's a department, but it's state agency status. It's got, it's got enough things going on there. We have a number of foundations that are doing early learning work and all of those kinds of things. So I certainly, what you've described is a lot of what goes on in my household, but that doesn't guarantee what goes on, obviously, in other households. And, what's interesting about all those things you just raised, of course, is it's school district by school district. And, in Bellevue School District, most of the kids coming in, I think, probably are going to have a pretty good day. I mean, although I will say we have 43 languages spoken in the Bellevue School District. The Bellevue that you may think you know, if you come up and visit us and go to Bellevue Square, that's about this much of Bellevue. East of 405, there's a whole nother world out there, but we have resources, and we are a community that supports our school district. I will tell you, one of the worst school districts in the country, Seattle. And they are going through a lot of very difficult challenges there. And in many cases, Seattle, in terms of how students are doing, it's almost like Alabama and Mississippi type numbers. And then secondly, because we have Seattle's a really big city, and there are a lot of community parts of Seattle that are like in other big cities, with lots of poverty and whatnot, and those schools really struggle, I think, to get at what you're getting at. So I don't know what the global answer is for that, but certainly, at least it seems to me in Washington, trying to get at these kids early is a big part of it.
If I could jump in quickly, we have to shift the conversation to get to your model. We have to shift it from money to focus, as you said, on that four-letter word, kids. And it's school district by school district, state by state, as to whether that conversation shifts. In most places, the focus is on money, and so it's just not going to go there.
Hello, I'm Julie Young, City Club member. Washington State has been fairly illustrious in having female governors, senators, and congresswomen. I would think Idaho not so much. And Oregon hasn't been so great either. My question is, would you say that this has to do with the dynamism of a female candidate, their message, the issues, the electorate, or the culture of your state? Thank you.
Well, great question. So now you give me an opportunity to brag on my spouse, because she's the kind of woman who does this stuff. I mean, my wife, when we were in D.C., she worked at the American Red Cross in a big position there. At one point in her life, she worked in the White House. I just told you she works at the Gates Foundation. Her clients right now include a little company called NBC. They do this thing called Education Nation, and she's the back office for that. She provides most of the content for what they're going to program over many channels. She looks, acts, and thinks like a lot of women I run around with in the greater Seattle area. And I don't know if it's because the water has more fluoride in it than it does in Portland. I've been waiting all day to get that one in. Then finally it just came in, the card locked in, and there it was.
Has any research been done on mixing marijuana and fluoride?
As long as it doesn't make your teeth green, you're okay.
That's right. But, I think there is something about, though, a big, vibrant community with we have a lot of traditional industries in the Seattle area, but we also have a lot of non-traditional, or at least new economy industries that just means you just break down the gender. I mean, I spend as much, in our home, we get up every day and figure out how the heck we're going to get from eggs in the morning to bedtime, right? I mean, and I think that goes on in lots of homes. And in our culture, at least, from one of the reasons we moved from D.C. to here or to the Seattle area, is it just felt like a great community for Cindy to be the kind of woman she wants to be. And it isn't a woman who wants to have it all, but she also doesn't want somebody else telling her what she can and can't do. And in my view, at least, I will tell you, D.C. is a great place. If any of you have daughters who want to go to D.C. and you want to see them get great opportunities, there's no gender bias in Washington. It's, can you get the work done? Can you work hard and get it done? That's a pretty cool thing. My sense in Seattle is that there's a similar culture there as well. And I don't know, I have no idea what it's like here, but I know that maybe it's just because there's a lot of opportunities as well. I don't know.
We've had 2 women elected to Congress from Idaho, one in the 1950s, a Democrat, and one more recently in the 1990s, Helen Chenoweth. We have never had a major party nominee who was female in either party in Idaho. My wife, Tony bragged appropriately on his wife. My wife says the next Democratic governor of Idaho is not born yet, but she is going to be terrific. So in Idaho, it is somewhat of a cultural thing. I have a very accomplished spouse, PhD, organizational development specialist, works for the largest hospital system in Idaho. Last thing in the world she would think about is running for public office. And to be honest with you, I think, and I'm not trying not to pander to the women in the room, but it is enormously more difficult to get traction as a female politician in most places than it is for a man. A man, in many cases, can devote full-time, 7 days a week, 18, 20 hours a day to doing that job, and women have lots more responsibilities and take those responsibilities a lot more seriously than a lot of men do. So there is a glass ceiling there, maybe self-imposed in some respects for women, but it does exist, and it certainly has been a factor in Idaho.
I'm sorry to say that we have run out of time for further questions, and we have to end this interesting conversation. Please join us next week for a debate on ballot measure 80, the Oregon Cannabis Tax Act. And as we close for today, please join me in offering a sincere thanks to today's speaker, Marc Johnson, Tony Williams, and Jim Moore. We are adjourned.